thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. I know this is a very relevant discussion, so I look forward to jumping right into here. So I'll be presenting on the challenges of conducting clinical trials during the COVID pandemic. Just a quick disclaimer, the views presented today are those of myself and not necessarily those of Dicerna, my employer. So as Dr. Jeffrey said, so I won't repeat this, but I've been in the industry for close to 20 years and started off on the site side and then been in the industry on the sponsor side ever since in clinical operations and development. I've worked in a multitude of different therapeutic areas and indications, including oncology, multiple sclerosis, other CNS indications, and more recently in rare disease. So this morning, I'd like to review the global impact and timeline of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's impacted all of us as we navigate these uncertain times in managing our ongoing clinical trials, the regulatory guidance that has been made available for us to reference, considerations and challenges for ongoing clinical trials, adapting for new clinical trials. So what else should we be considering as we plan for initiating new clinical trials moving forward? And then ending on a quick one slide, a few thoughts about what does the future hold. So jumping into the global impact, I think we could all agree that COVID-19 has consumed everything we do. You can't turn on the news, browse the internet, talk to a friend or a colleague without some mention of COVID or the impact that it's had on all of our daily lives, including what we do every day here in managing clinical trials. So as a quick timeline review, back at the end of what seems like forever ago, but really wasn't, at the end of 2019, the first patient was reported in China. By the end of the year, the World Health Organization was alerted to multiple cases in China. And early in 2020, COVID-19 was identified as the new virus. The first global case outside of China a week later in mid-January was reported. If you fast forward a couple months, in March, in mid-March and then the end of March, both the FDA and then the EMA have published guidance documents, the first guidance documents on the conduct of clinical trials during COVID-19, addressing many important factors that helped us all make sense of what actions we needed to quickly implement to manage our ongoing clinical trials. And then since then, there's been several updates, the latest for the EU at the end of April, and the FDA actually just recently published an update at the end of last month. So jumping right into those regulatory guidances as the next agenda item, I want to quickly review some key takeaways that I found from that were very relevant in the guidance documents by both the FDA and the EU EMA. There are other guidance documents out there. So if you're operating in the UK, the MHRA has one, PMDA. So I do recommend in whichever region you're operating, please refer to the latest relevant guidance. This is not an exhaustive list, and I definitely highly recommend you pulling up the actual documents themselves and supportive documents if you already haven't done so. There's a lot of good material directly from the regulators as well as others who have interpreted since the release of these guidance documents. So I think hopefully, really quickly, helping set the stage, the document, the FDA document, I really enjoy. While the full 35 pages is a good read, the end with the Q&A section, I find it very consumable. So I definitely do recommend going through that. I broke it down into several topics over the next couple slides. So on the topic of initiating new trials, both the FDA and EMA align that, assessing the feasibility on does it make sense to initiate a new trial imminently, or can it be held off? Is there enough cause to move forward on initiating a new trial that hasn't started yet, considering the current state of the healthcare? The FDA states specifically that impact on the both federal and state level ability, local ability to work on fighting off the pandemic or handling the pandemic should be taken into consideration. And the EMA goes a step further, saying that they expect additional risks related to participants in the benefit risk section of the protocol to be stated. For safety reporting, they both are aligned that you should continue and adapt recording or collection as needed, but there should absolutely be there's no exception that AEs and obviously SAEs need to be reported as they always should be. For ongoing trials, which I'll spend the bulk of my talk this morning in future slides going into, both the FDA and EU similarly have similar guidances. Some of the differences: the FDA does go about talking about measures that should be identified in the CSR. So they are expecting a separate section in your study CSRs for any trials that were ongoing during COVID that talk about what mitigations were taken, a list of all participants that were affected by the pandemic, and then how your analysis was impacted or by any mitigations taken, deviations occurred, et cetera. Ultimately, both agree that the patient's well-being is of utmost importance and should be at the front of mind when making decisions on whether or not to continue ongoing trials or how to adapt them in the COVID setting. Moving on to a few other topics that are addressed in these documents. So on monitoring, and this would be site monitoring of data, they both agree that utilization of centralized and remote monitoring is allowed. As we know, in the EU, GDPR is a very strict and comprehensive set of guidelines to ensure the protection of patient information, data, and their privacy. So there are additional safeguards that we as sponsors and if you're outsourcing, our CRO partners would need to ensure before enabling remote SDV outside of the United States, specifically in the EU. Inspections and auditing, the EU specifically calls out that use of remote access, if there is an ability to remotely access data, that inspections could continue to take place during the COVID pandemic. And if not, then sponsors should expect delays to occur in submissions and approvals. The FDA has remained relatively silent in their document. They don't specifically call out impact to inspections and auditing, although I think in general, I've personally seen a delayed response in anything non-COVID related by pretty much all of the competent authorities. With regards to investigational medicinal product or study drug, the FDA initially had just a generic, but as they adapted and evolved their guidance document, they actually break down the guidance on how to handle IMP during COVID-19 into two different risk categories. So low risk IMP versus high risk. And specifically, there's if you have products or studies that use infusion products, I definitely encourage you to read that specific language, as they are in more recent versions of the guidance, they have specifically called out how to handle providing infusion products differently than, let's say, low risk investigational medicinal product. And they actually consider or recommend you consulting with the appropriate review division prior to implementing any changes. The EU states that direct-to-patient shipping, which is a term you'll hear a bunch this morning from me about as one of the mitigations to the challenges that we face, is preferred from the site in terms of maintaining data privacy of patients' addresses and personal information. However, if the site's unable to, then depot to participant is allowed. They also state that larger amounts of IMP to sustain longer periods of time, that a site might be shut down. So if you normally provide a 1 month supply or a 3 month supply, you can consider providing 6 months or longer worth of supply to ensure that patients have continuity of treatment. Both agencies recommend risk assessments to be performed and properly documented to ensure that approaches on how you're protecting participants in your revised management of the studies is clearly indicated. Furthermore, investigators are encouraged to perform a risk assessment at the individual participant level for each ongoing participant in any ongoing trials in the EU. Informed consent is still expected. We know that during COVID-19, many hospitals and clinics remain shut down to essential activities, and reconsenting for ongoing trials or for changes might not be possible for the typical or standard in-person approach. So alternative ways of obtaining reconsent should be considered, and it is of utmost importance to ensure that our trial participants are properly informed of any changes that are impacting them prior to them occurring, and documenting such appropriately. And then communications with the authorities. The FDA specifically calls out that many changes due to COVID-19 may be implemented prior to and even without IRB approval or amendment to the IND, but still require reporting, which is definitely a step back or a different way of how we normally operate, but it speaks to the necessity to quickly change approaches due to COVID-19, and two, to the fact that honestly the health authorities are overwhelmed with the number of submissions, and their prioritization is focusing on COVID-19 as well. So they recognize that they won't be able to respond as quickly as maybe we need them to, and encourage us to move forward. So in summary of these key regulatory guidances, my four key takeaways are: patient safety is of the utmost importance. That doesn't change from whether we're talking about COVID-19 impact or any other aspect of running clinical trials. Patient safety should always be at the forefront of all of our minds. Perform and document a risk assessment at the program level, at the study level, and even at the participant level when considering the best path forward for ongoing clinical trials. You want to limit the potential exposure of patients and site staff. And then lastly, protocol deviations are going to occur. So don't try to think that you're going to get through the ongoing effects of the pandemic without any deviations occurring. Record them and make sure there's a way to mark them as COVID related, so you could address that in a study report at the end of the study. So moving into considerations for ongoing clinical trials, and I'll have Sam pull up the first poll question. So in March of 2020, back when the COVID pandemic really started to kick off and we had these guidance documents published, approximately how many pivotal studies were ongoing with readouts scheduled by the end of the year? 85, 190, 300, or 525 trials?
I will have that show up on the screen for you, Jay. Yep, so as Jay mentioned, in March 2020, approximately how many pivotal studies were ongoing with readouts scheduled by the end of the year? There's four options: 85, 190, 300, and 525. So Jay, I guess I'll give people about 10 to 15 seconds to think and answer.
Thank you, Sam. I just want to confirm, I should have confirmed a few slides ago, you're able to see my full screen slides, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Another 5 more seconds, ladies and gentlemen. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so Jay, looks like we have a clear winner.
Yeah, 300, nice job, everyone. So 300, there was just over 300, I'm gonna close that. So there was just over 300 clinical trials in March of 2020 that were ongoing, approaching readout. Obviously, there was a ton more clinical trials that were impacted, non-pivotal trials in all different phases, as well as ones with readouts beyond 2020. So this was but just focusing even on that 300 number, that's a significant impact. And I broke down the impact on ongoing clinical trials into 3 different subsections. So the patients, the research or clinical site staff, and then overall operations. So over the next few slides, I want to really dive into some of the details on challenges and some mitigations that myself and my team have implemented over the last several months to ensure that we have the proper path forward for keeping patients, clinical site staff, and operations in mind as we proceed forward. So first, talking about the impact on patient participation. So if we put ourselves in the shoes of these in patients for a few minutes, ultimately and most importantly, we want to assess the benefit-risk ratio for continuing versus early termination. Um, this is going to be very dependent, both at the study level and to determine based on what phase of study is the trial that is ongoing, what is the treatment, what is the how far along, how much do you as the sponsor know about the drug being studied, et cetera. And also at the end of the day, at the individual participant level, and this is where the role of the investigator comes in, consulting with the sponsor as needed to determining, has the benefit risk ratio changed for continuing a patient on study versus early terming or early withdrawing from a study, based on the current situation at the site involved. For many treatments, withdrawing treatment or suddenly stopping treatment can cause a larger safety impact than potentially just missing a dose or delaying a dose. So there's a lot of considerations to take into place when assessing this benefit risk ratio and how it has potentially changed due to the COVID pandemic. Furthermore, so you determine that you want your patients to continue. Can you revise the schedule of assessments as needed? So taking a hard look at, what visits in your schedule of events can be altered to become remote visits, or what visits can be skipped entirely in the face of the COVID pandemic. The agency has stated that COVID mitigation should be clearly detailed. How we handle this is as an appendix to our protocol. So for any sites that were impacted by the ongoing COVID pandemic, we had an appendix for them to refer to, which stated which assessments were must-have in our eyes versus what's were nice to have or were able to be skipped if there was complications in or unavailability of patients traveling, sites not being open, physicians not being available to treat. And ultimately, this is all in the sense of limiting exposure while maintaining the overall safety. So we want to continue IMP administration. You want to continue clinical assessment. You want to continue lab assessments. You need to show that you have maintaining overall safety of the participants. So you can't just stop collecting lab values, for example, if on your schedule of events, based on where you are in development, you're collecting them normally once a week. Maybe you could argue that every other week is acceptable, or you could look for alternative laboratory labs that are maybe in the community based or outside of the typical hospital where a higher concentration of COVID-19 patients are being treated, thus increasing the risk of potential exposure. The FDA specifically states that sponsors should evaluate whether it's feasible to use alternative laboratories or imaging centers, for example. They go on to say that in such cases where that the general safety focused assessments are routinely conducted at this similar laboratory, that it is acceptable to proceed with that collection. However, if results are being used for primary or secondary efficacy endpoints or even certain safety endpoints, that further discussion is warranted with the relevant division within the FDA. So you really need to, it's not necessarily as straightforward, and the FDA has evolved their guidance to say that, yes, we recognize that you want to limit the exposure and maybe not bring your patients in on a weekly or monthly basis to the hospital. However, if some of these endpoints that you're collecting are linked to primary or secondary endpoints, a further discussion on how the analysis and where you're performing this analysis may impact your data at the end of the study. The use of telemedicine, the use of electronic patient-reported outcomes instead of the traditional in the office paper or interview method. So there's a lot of different mitigations that could be put into place to limit the exposure. Another guidance that the FDA spoke on is telemedicine. And I know from talking to colleagues and peers that some people have tried to just use FaceTime. And while that is a convenient method, I think the FDA would look upon that and probably frown upon that, especially in a non-emergent situation, as they specifically said that use of telemedicine, there should be procedures put in place to protect the participant privacy and confirm the investigators and participants' identities, and making sure that they're trained on how to use, and that there's local policies or local procedures that these clinicians have on the use of technology to perform telemedicine visits. Switching gears and focusing on the clinical trial site staff now, I think there are several important factors that we should think of when the impact and the challenges that the trial site staff are facing. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I actually started off as a site coordinator early in my career for 3.5 years at Dana-Farber, and I never forget that time, because everything we do as a sponsor ultimately impacts the site staff. Any protocol changes, any changes in vendors or technology, it's rolling downhill to the sites and then ultimately the patients. So it's important to think about our trial site staff as well. And I know in specifically, for example, in one of the rare disease programs that I'm managing, we heard from a lot of physicians and research nurses that they were actually being pulled away from their traditional responsibilities of working on clinical trials and being pulled back into the main study wards or the main hospital units and floors to take care of the overwhelming number of COVID patients that were being treated just a few months ago. So as we all wait and see if we'll see another flux in COVID, that could reemerge. So it's something to think about, is the reallocation of resources. Do your study site staffs have enough allocation, enough bandwidth to continue the ongoing trial? Is there enough trained support staff to oversee the ongoing patients? And that's a critical aspect per the FDA that should be determined when assessing if a trial should be ongoing. These site staff are also adapting to new safety protocols. Not only are locations temporarily closing or having reduced hours, but the typical time, I'm sure we've all, or most of us have now gone out and about in the past few months, everything, there's new protocols where everything gets wiped down in between, less patients in waiting rooms, you wait in your car, everything has slowed down and it takes more time. So the impact for a high enrolling site is they won't be able to see the same number of patients. And once again, this goes back to my other slide about, do they really need to come in to a trial site to be seen or to complete a visit, or what parts of the visits can be pushed to a more virtual setting? And then lastly, adapting to changing technology. I'm a big fan of technology, as is I know many of you are. But introduction of new technology, especially kind of quote unquote overnight, as we look to adapt and really pivot to a more virtual setting, can put an added strain on site staff that are less familiar with some of this new technology. We might spend quite a bit of time with these vendors, vetting them out before we select them and feeling really comfortable with them. And then we just turn around and push them out on the sites with little training. On top of everything else they're managing, I think we should think about the impact on the site staff as we're asking them to adapt quite quickly to changing technology. My next slide, I have 5 different areas of additional operational challenges that we're all facing in managing clinical trials during the COVID pandemic. So first off, supply chain. So how can we ensure that not only study drug, but ancillaries are made available? I think, I know personally, we've had reports of shortage of gloves, shortage of normal saline, shortage of other ancillaries that many of us use and supply to our clinical trial sites as part of the normal operating procedures to be able to execute on our clinical trials. And if there's shortage supplies, how can your sites be ensured to have access to these as they continue on over the next several months or even longer? And then specifically returning back to the study drug, if a research pharmacy is shut down due to local hospital policy, your drug that you've sent there is now stuck there. And I've actually had this occur. So how do you handle that? There's no access to the research pharmacy. The research pharmacy is separate from the main hospital pharmacy. And let's say the hospital is being quite uncooperative, rightfully so, as they focus on a global pandemic. So you need to find alternative methods, and both guidance documents, as I highlighted earlier, reference the ability to enable direct-to-patient shipping. If a site's closed down, although that's a preferred method, there are ways, and while it takes some time and there are additional operational challenges that this introduces, ultimately you're ensuring the continuity of treatment and continuity of care for these patients that are in need. Working with your supply partners to allow depot to patient shipment and protecting their personal address and finding ways to work around that. I know a lot of IRT vendors are highly focused on quickly rolling out DTP or improving their DTP capabilities. Another creative way that we utilized on my program was home nursing. So we had no home nursing set up for other means as already on our study. So we expanded our scope of services and training, where we actually had, if the sites were open or from the depot, sent our home nurses directly the medication, and then they transported them with the proper procedures and policies in place to the patient's home. This allowed us to maintain a blind that was needed in our double-blind placebo-controlled study. So we didn't impact our potential blinding considerations while ensuring continuity of care. The next two are protocol amendments, and then the competent authorities and IRBs and ECs. So there will be protocol amendments. It's up to you on the style of whether you're going to list COVID mitigations per section or have just an appendix at the end. It is recommended that you really take a look at your schedule of events, your schedule of assessments, any changing of reporting or data collection, and handling of protocol deviations. Those should all be addressed to allow the continuation of a trial in a COVID setting. And then you should expect you should expect changes to how whether the competent authorities, IRBs or ECs are how we normally interact and operate with them. Not only are non-COVID submissions significantly delayed and deprioritized in my experience, but there's also changes in what needs to be reviewed and approved, as I mentioned earlier, prior to implementing versus waiting for an official okay to proceed. So definitely I recommend consulting with not only the competent authority in the country you're operating, but the local EC or IRB that oversees your study conduct. As previously mentioned, protocol deviations are going to occur. So make sure that there's a plan, whether it's yourself or your CRO, on how to document them, CTMS, EDC, however you're documenting them. And really what I have found as a best practice is being able to check off whether it's COVID related or not. So you could then have a subset and analyze the COVID-19 related ones, if needed, separately from the run-of-the-mill protocol deviations. And then lastly, a big impact and a big challenge that I think we're all facing is how do we continue monitoring our clinical studies? How do we go out and ensure that I focused a lot on patient safety, but data integrity is the other pillar that we all need to focus on when we oversee clinical trials. So how do we ensure data integrity during these times where we're switching to a lot more virtual type of setting? So remote SDV, yes, maybe you as a sponsor feel comfortable allowing remote SDV and your CRO has the means to do so. But do your sites who are already resource constrained, do they have e-source? And if they don't, do they really have the time to be redacting and scanning things in? So it's a big, complicated challenge to transition to remote SDV if that was not something that was in the plans from the beginning. It's not insurmountable. It is something that we continue, and I think you'll continue to see sites slowly adapt to as we move forward, but this will take time. Other issues of monitoring, IMP reconciliation, and other impacts that you're able to assess typically on site. How do you adapt? Do you feel comfortable as a sponsor doing IMP reconciliation on a video monitoring visit per se? So the backlog of used vials before they're destroyed on site don't overwhelm our sites, as an example. So really quickly in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about adapting for new clinical trials and what the future holds, and then I'd love to take a couple of questions. So if you're starting a new trial, so instead of the considerations for ongoing trials, starting a new trial, really the takeaway is to plan, 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 as we always should be. But I really challenge your team to look for flexibility of assessments. Here at Dicerna, under our CMO's guidance, we've taken the approach of, does a visit need to occur at all? And if yes, there is a certain data point at that time point that we feel strongly impacts our ability to assess the efficacy or safety of the product being studied, then the next question in the decision tree is, does it need to be done in a clinical setting, or can it be done remotely? Can we limit the amount of time patients and their families are spending traveling to a site, being potentially exposed, whether it's COVID or any other potential illness? Plan for additional time needed. As I've already stated, there is a deprioritization of non-COVID related protocols that we've experienced. I think we also need to think about additional recruitment challenges, and this could be a whole nother 30-minute talk or more, but patients now have this additional risk to consider of potential exposure to COVID-19. As a trial participant, regardless of how much we could pare down our protocols or make them virtual, there's still an increased likelihood of more exposure to hospital or clinic settings than if they were not in a trial. So this is something that they should factor in. And as the EU says, this should be added to the benefit risk ratio in the protocol section, and likely discussed in informed consent with your patients. Identify vendors who can help implement your virtual aspects. So as I touched on earlier, working with experienced vendors who have already done this. I'm all about being the first one to try out something new, but there's a lot of new here happening. So I think finding the right vendors that match your plan on how to adapt for the future. And then thinking about technology to increase remote data capture as well. So this kind of goes hand in hand on how you want to further use technology and introduce it into your setting. I have one other poll question that I'm interested for the participants. So has your organization shifted to allow more of a virtual trial experience? So as you're either ongoing trials or planning for new trials, how many of your trials allow for a virtual trial experience? Not 100%, but a virtual trial, but aspects of flexibility. So all of your trials, greater than 50%, but not 100% of your trials. Yes, you're doing that, but less than 50% of your trials, or not at all at this point.
And I'll give everyone an additional 15 seconds to think about this question. And Jay, we did receive a question from Gerald Shapiro. He's the CEO of FemMedical. He's just asking if you can define for him the two acronyms, SDV and IMP.
Sure, yeah, I apologize. Clinical operations, we live in a sea of acronyms. So SDV is source data verification. That's the process where a CRA or a monitor is verifying what is entered in the database and matches the source records. And IMP is investigational medicinal product. So that's your either study drug or comparator or placebo that is being studied or utilized in a treatment arm of a trial.
Wonderful. So, yeah, Jay, the results are up on the screen, and yeah.
Perfect. So it looks like it's about split 30-30-30. There's very few of us that 100% of our trials have virtual aspects. It looks like greater than 50%, a third, 50% or less, and then a third of you have still not approached implementing virtual aspects into your trials. So for me, as I wrap up this talk and take any additional questions, the question is not if another pandemic will happen, but rather when. So this I thought was an interesting slide that over the last 200 so years, there's been a number of pandemics declared by the World Health Organization. So what are we doing to prepare not only for COVID-19, but the next pandemic? And really what I see is that one of the benefits, there's not many in my opinion that are coming out of COVID-19. I think there's a lot of it's easier to focus on some of the negatives, but one of the positive is I truly believe we're going to see a shift in how we manage and how we design trials, how we conduct them. I think we are going to go to a more virtual setting, if not 100% virtual trials for certain indications or phases. Flexibilities for patients and sites to make it easier reduction of assessments. Maybe, yes, we're very used to collecting EKGs every week or every month, but maybe we could switch that to every quarter as you progress if the safety profile allows for that, for example. I think there's a lot of, well, we did that last time, so we did this, or others do it, so we're going to do it. There's a lot of copycatting going on in the industry regarding some of this in our protocol design. And I think we all should be challenged to pare down as much as possible. Yes, we want to maintain patient safety, but I think that you could argue that the pendulum is able to be shifted a bunch. While that may seem like cheaper trials or less expensive trials, I would say that the cost will likely be balanced out with the introduction of more technology, telemedicine, home nursing, remote management, and even the use of additional technology such as wearables, which I know many of us are already using, but I think an acceleration of even more wearables in the clinical trial setting. So I'd like to plug for the panel discussion this afternoon at 4 p.m. I will actually be joining that as a late addition, where the future of clinical trials and how the COVID pandemic has affected them will take place with a few great panelists. With that, I thank you for your time and would love to open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Jay. And as Jay mentioned, he will be part of the panel at 4 p.m. Eastern today. And we do also have a day 2 tomorrow of our summit. And Jay, there are 2 questions from you. One, we'll start with Melanie Frank, and she's asking, from a risk management standpoint, are there specific key risk indicators you have found helpful that can be tracked to mitigate risk due to COVID-19?
Absolutely. So I think the key risk indicators, I think, is exposure to clinic or hospital setting. So can you reduce the amount of visits necessary? And there's clear mitigations I think you could take to limit exposure. I think continuity of treatment. So how can you ensure continuity of treatment? And that's very dependent on the type of treatment, the phase of study, et cetera, what risk. So there's a lot regarding the continuity of treatment, but I think that is one to focus on, as well as continuity of oversight, safety oversight. So how can you ensure to maintain the safety oversight? What mitigations you could put in place that you're adapting your aspects of your trial, but you're not losing any oversight of the safety of the trial participants as they move forward.
And there's one more question for you, Jay, from Ronald Dornbos. He used to be the former head of innovation scouting with Takeda. And he's saying, maybe wishful thinking, but imagine we will have a vaccine for COVID-19 in a couple of months' time. Jay, how do you see the world going back to normal, and what would the new normal look like?
Sure. And I know I think that's a great question, and I rushed through it at the end due to time. But I think even with a vaccine in place, I still think that this has shown us, I think, while many studies have been impacted and slowed down, I know plenty of trials, including one of my own programs, that have pushed forward and continued enrollment. And I think it showed us that we can continue, we can introduce when forced, which this pandemic has had forced us to do, to be creative with how we collect data, how we do things more remotely. How do we make the patient experience? We talk a lot about patient-centric medicine. I think one of it is patient-centric trials, and how do we adapt our protocols to make them easier for trial participants? I think recruitment becomes more and more challenging for a number of reasons. So if we're able to make participation in trials easier for patients and their families, that will hopefully continue their desire to participate in clinical trials. Without the patients, we have no advances in medicine. We have no new drugs on the market. So it always really brings it back to the patients for me. We do it for the patients, and we should be mindful of their participation during these trials. So I think regardless if we have a vaccine in a couple of months or longer, the new normal should be changed. We shouldn't return to these very full protocols with lots of extra assessments that maybe aren't providing direct input to our primary and secondary endpoints, that force patients and their families to attend clinic visits on a more frequent basis than really what's required. So I'll stop there with my response.
Well, Jay, thank you very much. And if you're interested in connecting with Jay, just let me and my team know, and he'll be back later today at 4. Thank you so much.
Thank you.